The nurse is the strongest killer in Dead by Daylight. Even people who have never played the game know that she is effectively the Darth Vader of DBD. If you're against an experienced nurse player, you better start praying that it ends quickly and it doesn't hurt too much. She's dominated the game for 6 entire years, and despite plenty of nerfs, she remains far from dethroned. Even with 1 or 2 other killers reaching some ridiculous power levels over the years, none have managed to top her. But how has she remained unchecked for so long? Allow me to explain to you how the nurse broke Dead by Daylight and continues to break the game to this very day. The nurse released on the 18th of August 2016, just 2 months after Dead by Daylight first released alongside Nia Carlson in Chapter 1, The Last Breath. That's right, the killer that still dominates your matches to this very day was the first ever DLC killer added to the game, so as expected, she's been around the block. It's important to note that the nurse is a remnant from a different time, not just the old school metas and playstyles being different to what they are now, but behavior's design philosophy was far different to what it is nowadays. They didn't have to worry too much about balance as, quote, "we didn't even know how the game worked, they just had a cool idea and added it in." And I'm sure it comes as a massive shock to hear that the devs weren't too concerned about balance when creating the nurse, but jokes aside, it's important to remember that once upon a time, Dead by Daylight wasn't the behemoth it is nowadays, and the game genuinely started off as a passion project among a tiny development team. So much so that they didn't even come up with the game's name until it was nearing completion. As such, due to the nurse requiring a drastically different playstyle to the rest of the killer roster and the entire player base being much less skilled at the game, as once again the game was literally 2 months old at the time, the nurse's kit used to be slightly different but far stronger than it is nowadays. Original nurse. Movement speed 100%, the same as a sprinting survivor. Default blinks 3, significantly stronger add-ons, no light burn weakness, and the maximum possible blinks was 7. If you thought modern day nurse was bad, just imagine her with extra movement speed coming at you with 7 entire blinks. Even in those days where people barely had a basic understanding of the game as a whole, let alone the nurse as an individual character, it was clear that she was too powerful. The ability to teleport large distances and through walls was a huge strength in a game centered around chasing and catching up to survivors, and due to this immense power, it would only make sense for her ability to take a decent amount of skill and investment to get good value. But with an almighty 7 blinks, the nurse could just keep readjusting her position over and over again until she eventually found herself within lunge range. So it was kind of hard not to get value. But even if she somehow didn't land a hit with that many blinks, her movement speed being the exact same as survivors meant that she really didn't get punished much for poor plays. Things needed to change. So just over 1 month after the nurse's release, on the 23rd of September 2016, patch 1.1.2 released, bringing some well needed changes to the nurse. Nerf added the light burn vulnerability to the nurse. Nerf reduced default blink count from 3 to 2. Nerf reduced movement speed from 100% to 96.25%. Nerf various add-on nerfs including the extra blink add-ons. After these changes, her maximum possible amount of blinks was now 5, down from the previous 7. And these changes achieved 3 things. They brought down her overall power level, they made her take more skill, and they added some direct counterplay for survivors. They now made the nurse require considerably more skill to perform well, as she had to actually get good with her blink ranges, as she could only adjust her position with secondary blinks a few more times. And with that reduced movement speed, the blinks would no longer be just her ability, but her mobility too. While of course she could always blink around the map for better mobility and pressure, before weaker nurse players could kind of get away with walking around a lot of the time, only really blinking over loops or walls. This was no longer the case. It's also worth noting that while it was possible for her to have 5 blinks, the add-on nerfs now meant that having 5 blinks would come with a pretty hefty downside of those 5 blinks being incredibly short. So realistically speaking, the highest amount of blinks that she could have without it harming her more than helping her was 4. The direct counterplay aspect came from the light burn mechanic. If you don't know what that is, then I can't really blame you, as it is kind of a neglected mechanic in the grand scheme of things, but Lightborn is a mechanic that affects only the nurse and the Wraith, which makes them extremely vulnerable to flashlights while interacting with the Shadow Realm. What this means is if you shine a flashlight at an invisible Wraith or a nurse holding her blink in her hand, it will pull them both out of their powers and stun them, even if you're not pointing the flashlight at their face. This also affects the nurse in an additional way where if you point the flashlight at her while she doesn't have the blink in her hand, she is totally blocked from using her power until the flashlight is no longer being pointed at her, and this mechanic still affects her to this very day. While she was clearly extremely strong before these nerfs, nobody had truly mastered her yet, and even with these nerfs, the nurse's reign of terror was only just getting started. Slowly but surely, a small and dedicated portion of the community would dedicate hundreds of hours to mastering the nurse, getting to know all of her strengths, weaknesses, and quirks to become absolute powerhouses. With insanely accurate blinks, never falling for mind games, and next level map pressure, it was around this time that nurse players started figuring out how to play her optimally, and the results were sheer terror for survivors. But despite this, the nurse's kill rate remained incredibly low, in fact the lowest out of any killer in the game. How was there such a huge disconnect between the nurse's kill rate and her actual strength? Two reasons: difficulty and clunky feeling gameplay. Due to a lack of visual feedback showing the nurse how far she would blink, players would have to learn her blink ranges and charge times the hard way, trial and error. New nurse players were guaranteed to take a beating in their first few games as they had no way of knowing how far they were blinking without working it into their muscle memory. And due to the nurse now being the only killer in the game slower than survivors, without those blinks she's going to have a horrible time. In fact, what's even weirder is that there was a visual indicator that showed you how far the nurse would blink, but it was only accessible via one of her rarest add-ons. So the one thing that new nurse players needed is something that they would barely ever get the chance to use. So the first few games for new nurse players would result in them getting absolutely stomped, like 0 to 1 kill, and it would take lots of repeats of this beatdown before they would finally start doing well. But the thing is, the overwhelming majority of players would give up on the nurse before they've had their time to shine. Not just because nobody likes getting annihilated in their games, but also because there were so many frustrating, clunky, and unfun mechanics and interactions nurse players would have to deal with. The main one being fatigue. After the nurse blinks, she has a short window to start an attack, and whether she attacks or not, she goes into a fatigue, in which her movement speed is reduced even further, her screen gets significantly darker, her camera is forced to point to the floor, and it vigorously shakes left and right. I'm sure you can tell just from that description, but this mechanic is extremely annoying at best and downright nauseating at worst. Out of every video game I've ever seen, heard or played, I have never seen any game get as much accessibility backlash as DBD did for the nurse's fatigue. Many players straight up cannot play her or they will get sick. The idea behind this mechanic was to give survivors a chance to escape the nurse, break line of sight and hide away, because stealth was still a thing back when the nurse was designed. And while I understand the goal, there is no denying that the execution is terrible. But what makes it even worse is, this fatigue gets half a second longer for each additional blink used, so newer and lower skilled nurse players who needed to use more blinks on average would also face longer fatigue time. But wait, there's more. Lunging would increase the fatigue by a whole entire second too. So imagine being a brand new nurse player who uses all of your blinks to catch up, and then you miss your swing, and in turn you get an even longer fatigue time, even more time looking at that nauseating screen shake. That alone is enough to stop most people coming back to the nurse. So how does this tie into the nurse having low kill rates? Well, if players are almost guaranteed to do poorly in their first few matches, but also stop playing her after those first few poor matches, you can see how the stats will get all the low kill rates from new nurses, but then never get any of the high kill rates from good nurses, as most people give up before ever becoming a good nurse. So we have a ridiculously overpowered killer, but due to them being very difficult plus some poor design choices, not many people play her. Sounds like things needed to change, and they did. On the 23rd of January 2018, patch 1.9.0 released with some new nurse changes. What were they? Buff. The nurse no longer has a shorter lunge range than any other killer, as back then lunge range was tied to movement speed. Buff. The nurse can now look down to reduce the range of a blink that she charged too far. Buff. The nurse can now freely blink up and down between floors by looking up or down. Okay, while buffing the nurse of all killers was certainly a controversial decision, it seems like the goal behind these changes was to make her slightly less frustrating to play as, and as someone who used to play the nurse a lot at that point in time, the ability to look down to reduce overcharged blinks felt absolutely amazing. But it also meant that the nurse would get punished less if the survivor successfully pulls off a double back on them, which probably wasn't the best change for the overall health of the game, as if the survivor outplays you, you really should be punished for it. While these changes did make her feel much nicer to play as, they didn't quite have the impact the devs hoped. Many new nurse players still couldn't bear the fatigue, and her kill rate still remained the lowest in the game. While the nurse was ungodly overpowered, it was widely considered to be due to her add-ons. Unlike the hillbilly that only had 1 or 2 OP add-on combos, the nurse had plenty to choose from. Range add-ons, travel speed, 4 blinks with no downside, 3 blinks with extra range, 3 blinks with extra speed. It was kind of crazy. Top tier survivors learned that base kit, the nurse did in fact have counterplay. The issue is, this playstyle was drastically different to the way survivors would deal with other killers. Instead of looping, the main priority was always distance, and the second was line of sight. Unfortunately, due to good nurses being very rare, a lot of players never had the opportunity to learn how to deal with her. But top skill survivors respected good nurses as long as they weren't running ridiculous add-ons. This era was the nurse's prime. This was the point in time when the nurse was at her strongest since her initial set of nerfs, she felt the best to play, and had absolutely ridiculous add-ons. Bad nurse players would frequently bring in 3 or 4 blinks and still do well, and good nurses could go double blink range and effectively be everywhere at all times. The general consensus of the community was the nurse's add-ons 100% need serious nerfs, but the base kit might be okay. Nerf her add-ons and then we'll see if the base kit needs further nerfs down the line. So on the 29th of October 2019, almost 2 entire years since the nurse was buffed, a whole host of changes were brought onto her. What were they? Add-on changes. Additional blink add-ons were nerfed, replaced with new effects. Now only 1 add-on gives her an additional blink, but it comes with huge downsides. Blink range add-ons were nerfed. In fact, most, if not all of the nurse's add-ons were changed to either be nerfed or have a brand new effect. And unlike the hillbilly, these changes were received very well by the community for the most part. The nurse's add-ons were widely considered to be the thing that made her go from extremely strong but respectable to absolute BS, so seeing her add-ons be toned down was exactly what we wanted. But of course, things didn't stop there. Base kit nerfs. The nurse's ability now counts as 2 separate charges, each with its own cooldown of 3 seconds. This new cooldown stacks on top of her fatigue. This was one of the worst changes they could have possibly made to the nurse. The extra cooldown didn't have any tangible impact on her strength, so it was a fail balance-wise. But what it did do was make her feel even worse to play as. I already covered how bad the fatigue was, but having a fatigue, then a cooldown after the fatigue, that's literally a cooldown on a cooldown. What a ridiculous change. While the add-on changes were certainly what we needed, the base kit changes only made her pick rate and kill rate suffer more, as now not only were new players put off of her even more, but the cooldown was such an annoying feature that a lot of previously dedicated nurses just couldn't put up with her anymore. While there was no denying that she was still incredibly strong, she now felt even worse to play than ever before. But surely those add-on nerfs that we got would have brought down her power level to some degree, right? While yes, that is true, I think that loss of power from the add-ons was regained in the form of dedicated servers. Nowadays, it is so common for a nurse to blatantly miss a blink attack on you, swing in the completely wrong direction, and yet the game will somehow give her the hit anyway. I think just because of this, power-wise she's still pretty close to how she was before the nerfs. But now she's just less fun for everyone due to cooldowns on cooldowns for the nurse and terrible servers giving unfair hits for the survivors. And this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the nurse. There are so many other things to talk about, like dead zones, glitches with her being able to get out of bounds or into glitched spots, interactions with her specifically breaking certain perks, then in turn getting the perk nerfed for every other killer. There's just so much to talk about with the nurse that I couldn't possibly cover it all in one video. So now the only question that remains is, what do you think about the state of the nurse? Is there any way of making her fit into the game fairly? Let me know in the comments below, and thank you so much for sticking to the end. If you have any other things you'd like me to discuss in a similar style to this video, be sure to let me know. You can catch me live on twitch.tv/Ardetha.